For instance, like the number one sports story in politics for years has been trans athletes. And for me, the question I ask myself is, okay, broccoli with cheese melted on it. How do I do this? How can I attack a story that I think is worth explaining to people who are predisposed for understandable reasons to know all of the beats of how this argument goes and why it's an 80-20 issue for Republicans, with Democrats being an enormous loser. And my whole thing was, what would it be like to be a trans female athlete who's terrible at sports? Like, what if you're bad at sports? Like the comedy of like expecting that you're going to be facing Goliath at the plate. And in fact, they suck because most people who play sports, not to broadly gesture in both of our directions, suck. That's most people. And so it would be with any population. And it turned out that in the state of Ohio, when these rules were being passed, there was one varsity athlete who qualified who was being affected by these rules, these anti-trans rules. And the name of the athlete in question is Ember Zelch. And Ember Zelch, by Ember's own admission, sucks at softball. Never once has hit a home run. Third string backup catcher. Ember's mom, Minna Zelch, went on the record with me to talk about how terrible her daughter is.
You're too humble to say this, but John Oliver recently in his segment lifted up that scene.
And it's just the story that Fox News doesn't want you to know, which is to say that we're dealing here with that story with a moral panic, with very little numeracy. There are less than 10 NCAA trans athletes, period. And there are real scientific disagreements, which we've covered on our show, that are real about what should the rules be. There should be hormone regulations. There are benefits conferred by male puberty. Those are real scientific competitive advantage debates that we should have and cannot be easily waved away, even by the most inclusive people who are in favor of welcoming as many trans athletes as possible. Those regulations and rules are real and must exist from a competitive equity, fairness, principle perspective. But when it comes to who are the people that are gathering and basically becoming these protagonists in such a crazy amount of coverage, such that it's one of the reasons why the Democrats lost this election. We should know it's less than 10 college athletes, and in the state of Ohio, it's one softball player who sucks. And so it's merely like that's the undeniable part. Get someone to laugh at themselves in the athlete, the mom to laugh at the entire enterprise and herself as well, and then talk about the context for the governmental regulations that are actually on the table, passed at the point we did the story in 23 states. States that couldn't find sometimes the athletes to justify the energy. And so it's just this goose chase for a boogeyman that in a couple of cases, yes, we can have the argument about, is this person being fairly regulated by these hormone therapy rules? But in most cases, it's such a comically overblown story. And so I say all of that to say, there is a sports story, there is a politics story, there is humor, and there is substance. And my goal is to tell you that story in a way that by the end, on either aisle, you're like, shit, that's a good point.
So as an issue that obviously a lot of Democrats are struggling with, and as someone who does communications for a living, what's the message that you would give Democrats who are struggling with how to talk about this issue?
Yeah. I think about this all of the time. And I think it needs to begin with a reality check on how often this happens, right? So the story, the marketing on this is so profoundly effective by the right because the hypothetical is convincing. Your daughter's losing her trophies, scholarship. She's at physical risk because we're not willing to say what's obvious, that boys are better than girls at sports. That sales pitch wins 80-20. And I get it. Hard to argue on those terms. But why do we accept the terms? What we should be talking about is how often it's the case that you're never going to encounter one of these athletes. And further, we agree that boys from a hormonal, puberty, testosterone perspective have real advantages. They are stronger. We need to be very clear-eyed about the science is. Let's be very open and conciliatory when it comes to not denying what the scientific research is saying. What's so exciting about turning this from an 80-20 issue to something that is, I don't know, realistically 60-40, if that, it's that science is not at odds with the position that I personally think the left should take, which is that there need to be rules, there need to be regulations informed by science. But then when it comes to how many cases are on these edges, right? Where are these really hard calls to make when it comes to somebody who is really good? What we're talking about there is a case that we can absolutely debate, but is so rare as to render the amount that we talk about it absurd. It's absurd. Why is this? When it comes to power ranking, to use another sports metaphor, the issues that affect Americans, this doesn't crack the top 1,000. Now, we can debate as issue number 1,001 what it's like when Leah Thomas ties for 5th with Riley Gaines at the NCAA, swimming championship. We can talk about that, which is a real story and is, not to be waved out of hand because, you 5th place. That's not nothing. That's yeah, sure. I have sympathy for that, of course. But that's the story that got turned into a inside of every family in America is this fear that your daughter's going to be beaten up and have her future stolen from her as an athlete because of a trans person. It doesn't happen like that. And then, frankly, if you're to go out and meet these trans athletes as I have, and I wrote my first story about trans athletes because I was fascinated by the conflict. This was 2012. I published in Sports Illustrated a story with David Epstein, who went on to go write The Sports Gene and Range and these great New York Times bestsellers. We co-authored a story that was entirely about what should the rules be when trans athletes began to emerge in college. And what was so funny when we wrote it was that we needed to pitch that so hard. Because it was like, this is obscure. No one's talking about this. No one's thinking about this. And now it's flipped to where it's everywhere. But I say all that to say that when you go out and interview these athletes, something that we need to be clear about too is that nobody becomes a trans person to steal trophies. Nobody becomes a trans person to be better at sports relative to their competition, because to be a trans person in America is genuinely fucking miserable. And then when you layer onto that, you got to take all of these hormone therapies. You got to take 9 pills a day. You have to go through medical processes, be vetted legally by the state, and sign paperwork that gets your body examined. To go through all of those hoops, it's just a restoration. Dan, this has been a winding answer. My hope is that there's a restoration of good faith when it comes to who these people are, what they want, and how often they're actually good at the thing you presume they're awesome at. And in the end, with that numeracy restored, it's just insane to think that we've spent so much time being worried about them and debating them as if it's going to decide the future of our country.
And to your point, and I think I'll speak for myself, but I'm sure this resonates with you as an Asian American. We can, as you say, we can have the debate about the sports part of it and the rules therein. But there is a population of people who are using the sports issue as an excuse to be transphobic, in the same way that people were homophobic during the continuous fight for LGBTQ rights, for Loving versus Virginia. I think about interracial marriage bans. These are constant societal challenges when change is happening and tolerance therein that I think is wrapped up in this in a way that it shouldn't be.
Look, man, I go watch you. I take pride in you going on CNN at the table with Scott Jennings. And I just heard him say enough, the most obvious point, which is it's an 80-20 issue. We're going to win it, run the ball every time, like we're going to win. And from a perspective, we talk about the politics of it, the messaging, the marketing of it. When it comes to the principle of it, What we're talking about is an incredibly at-risk population of human beings who deserve civil rights, who attempt suicide at a rate, I believe, at last check, of 1 in 3. And so if the whole notion is most people don't give a shit about them, we know. They know that more than anybody. And the question is, when do we as a civil society value the rights of people who are going to be trampled because it's politically expedient, because they're a useful cudgel to beat a political party with that they may not even belong to? So to me, it's like, from a principle perspective, it's a worthwhile discussion. From a political one, it's a totally mismanaged and under-leveraged conversation that is perfect and 80-20 for the Republicans because it requires nuance.